The achievements of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, started from a national crisis that threatened to break the foundations of democracy in the country. His demonstrated leadership and his way of facing the Civil War and the abolition of slavery have made American people love him and consider him their best president. His capacity and intelligence have been praised by many historians as they consider that his defense of the Union improved the living conditions of the whole country. He was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky. He was the son of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, a couple of farmers who left Virginia and, like many others, traveled to the West. 2 years later, realizing that the land was not suitable for cultivation, Thomas decides to move to another nearby land that is more prosperous. For the year of 1815, Lincoln entered the school to learn the basic knowledge of reading, writing, and mathematics. However, he considered that he learned more in the field. The following year, the family moved to Indiana because of the attempts to confiscate the land they bought and worked. It was necessary to go to a place where proper rights were guaranteed. The border states of Kentucky and Indiana were the playground for Abraham, Sarah, and their other brother who died in childhood, Thomas. In 1818, Nancy Lincoln dies of milk disease and left 11-year-old Sarah in charge of her family that included her father, Abraham, and Nancy's cousin, Dennis. Approximately between the years 1818 to 1819, Thomas meets Sarah Bush, a woman who was also widowed and with whom he would later marry. Abraham got on well with his new mother, along with the three children she brought with her. Due to the condition of poverty suffered by the large family, Lincoln complained that his entire childhood only opted to go to school 1 year and decided to help to work for his neighbors. At age 16, Lincoln was a meter and 80 centimeters tall, and he was a strong man with a good reputation, and he worked in a lot of jobs, like a woodcutter. Also, he was good at telling stories. Although he was considered a great conversationalist, someone reliable and skillful in the task he was asked to perform, was classified as lazy because he was always engaged in reading or reflection activities. In 1830, the family moved again, this time to Decatur, in the state of Illinois. In this place, Lincoln carried out the work of rowing a battle, which was used to transport a few people along the Mississippi River to New Orleans. In 1832, Abraham reaches the age considered for a young man to take advantage of himself, so he returned to Illinois to settle in the newly founded city of Salem. In that same year, the Black Hawk War broke out, and this confrontation between settlers and Saint Indians disputed lands near the Mississippi. Abraham was 23 years old when he decided to enroll in military service, quickly obtaining the mandate of a small troop due to his attitude as a soldier. Upon returning to Salem, he enjoyed the recognition of his neighbors, who encouraged him to participate in the election for the state legislature in the Whig Party, a candidacy that ended in defeat. The following year, thanks to the help of some friends, Abraham got the position of postmaster, but the scarce income forced him to do other jobs to guarantee a good livelihood. By becoming an assistant to the county surveyor, he could devote time to his studies of geometry, trigonometry, and rectangular surveying. In 1834, he was again nominated to the legislature, obtaining the victory. Motivated by one of Whig's party bosses, he devotes himself to the study of the laws, graduating in law for the year 1836. In December of that same year, he participated in the 10th General Assembly of Illinois, in which he took an active part in the development of laws and reforms, also manifesting opposition against slavery. Lincoln at a time suffered severe mood swings, changing from passionate to depressed, as a fact that left him a short time abstracted from any activity he performed. For 1842, he married Mattie Todd, a lady from a well-off family with good relations with whom he has three children. In 1846, he was elected as a member of the House of Representatives in Washington. In this place, he won detractors for his participation in the abolitionist movement, in addition to criticizing the U.S.-Mexico War that led to the incorporation of Texas and New Mexico as states of North America. This position against the expansion of the U.S. territory cost him a considerable sum of votes and failed in the senatorial election of 1849. Disappointed, he retired from politics and for 6 years worked as a solicitor. By the end of this retreat, Lincoln was still a lawyer and a provincial politician, certainly prestigious in his state, but almost unknown outside of Illinois. Nobody imagined that 7 years later he would be elected President of the United States, much less that his election was a trigger for the secession of the Southern slave states and the beginning of a bloody war. Because his abolitionist ideology was realistic and moderate, Lincoln considered slavery a social evil and was firmly convinced that it was necessary to prevent its spread by the North American states. However, he did not intend to impose immediate abolition of the Southern territories. He was in favor of a progressive and peaceful action in favor of the disappearance of slavery, while new territories of the West were opened, which caused more conflicts between the North and the South. All wanted to control these zones. The South needed more land to create the enormous cotton plantations and the other cultures where the slaves worked. For their part, the North wanted that these western lands were reserved for independent farmers. The problem came to the Congress and a vote was taken. The crucial question was whether the new states were slave owners or not. The matter concluded in 1854 when the Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Law. This proposal was presented by a political rival of Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, who was then a senator from Illinois. The racist policy of Douglas provoked a wave of protest in the North to let the new territories be slavers. The laws of Missouri that prohibit slavery since 1820 was revised after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Law. After approximately 5 years in anonymity after the disintegration of the Whig Party, Lincoln reappears as a founding member of the Republican Party in Illinois in 1854. When the issue of slavery passed from the social to the political plane, again following the approval of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed the establishment of slavery in the northwestern states. As already indicated, Lincoln did not support the abolition of slavery in the states in which it already existed, especially in those of the South. Each territory had to legislate in this respect according to the conscience of its citizens. However, he strongly opposed the establishment of slavery in those states in which it was not authorized. Particularly famous for the vehemence of his verve and the solidity of his arguments was the anti-slavery speech he delivered in the city of Peoria, Illinois in 1854. In 1856, a new clearly abolitionist party was formed in the northern states, the Republican Party, which considered itself a heir to the political tradition of President Thomas Jefferson. Committed to the cause against slavery, Lincoln joined the Republican Party the same year of its founding. Defeated again in the Senate election of 1858, the intensity of the anti-slavery campaign and the dialectical duels he had with the Democratic candidate Stephen Douglas, elected on the occasion, restored his lost popularity. The debate revealed his extraordinary gift as a speaker, the depth of his thought and preparation, the maturity of his judgment, and a great faith in his mission. On February 27, 1860, a large auditorium in New York surrendered to one of his most memorable speeches from the homestead. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. This speech in the debate with Douglas made him famous nationally. In 1860, it was rumored that he could be a candidate for the presidency. At first, he believed he could not win, but the pressures of the Republican leaders came into effect. The moderation of their position was decisive, so that on May 17, 1860, the Chicago Republican Convention elected him the presidential candidate to the detriment of William Seward, representative of the most radical abolitionists. The creation of the Republican Party served not only to cause alarm and irritation in the South, but also to divide the Democratic Party precisely on the issue of slavery. Thus, in the election of 1860, there were four parties: the two Democrats of the North and South, the Whig Party, and the Republican Party, whose candidate was Abraham Lincoln. On November 6, 1860, favored by the internal divisions of the Democrats, Lincoln won the presidential elections. The Republicans won the victory in all the northern states, while the other three parties split the southern ones. The Republican Party was unmistakably abolitionist, and Lincoln, despite his moderate temper, has manifested himself as one of the firmest anti-slavery. His election could not but trigger the reaction of the southern states. Before Lincoln officially assumed the presidency, the state of South Carolina took the initiative to leave the Union. Following in Carolina's footsteps, the day of taking office on March 4, 1851, 7 states had already been extended, and another 4 were about to do so. Consuming without difficulty the succession, the divided states were organized in a new political unit, the Confederation or the Confederate States of America, with capital in Richmond, Virginia, and Jefferson Davis as president. It was rumored that the Southerns planned to assassinate the elected president, so the security took extreme precautions in the day he was to swear the office in Washington. 30,000 people gathered in the park near the Capitol to listen in silence to his investiture speech, addressed the people of the South, and promised that he did not ban slavery in the regions. Lincoln wanted to think that the Union would be saved without bloodshed, but declared that he wanted to defend the Union and extend federal law to all states as allowed by his position. On March 5, the day after his taking his position, rebel troops surrounded Fort Sumter, located at the entrance to the port of Charleston in South Carolina. The war was inevitable. Only 5 weeks after the inauguration, the Confederates began attacking Fort Sumter and started a civil war. Lincoln said it was an insurrection, so he mobilized 75,000 volunteers for 3 months to crush them. The Congress was not constituted until July 4. Without its participation, Lincoln established a blockade, suspended the habeas corpus for unfair activities, spending money without the approval of the Camera, and controlling the entire war process. This expansion of the presidential powers was much discussed. When the Congress was formed, it compromised on many legislative details, but retained its independence in the issues of executive responsibility. While everyone believed that the war would be quick, the North counted on the support of 23 states and 22 million people. On the other hand, the 11 southern states had a population of about 9 million people, but about 4 million were slaves. The South was basically agricultural, while the North had industries to make munitions and weapons, in addition to the railroad and a very powerful navy that could block the Confederate ports. But the Southern military advantage lies on its leaders. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was a professional soldier. In addition, most Army officers came from the south of the country, like Generals Robert Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. That's why when the war began, the biggest headache for Lincoln was finding competent officers to fight with the South. In 1861, both sides traded, and in July, the troops led by General Irvin McDowell marched to Virginia to crush the Confederates and end the rebellion, but it was not so. The disaster of Bull Run, the first great battle of the war, would be the first of the defeats that the Union would suffer on the Virginia front, while the Union tied 2 other defenses in Tennessee and another in the Mississippi River. Lincoln granted the command of the eastern forces to General George McClellan, a 35-year-old veteran of the war with Mexico. All defended him as presumptuous, but Lincoln had a lot of faith in him. That's why McClellan trained his army meticulously. But as the months passed, they were not able to advance to Virginia. The same situation was repeated in the Western Front, although the officers prepared the soldiers, they were not ready to fight. With little military experience and reticent general to act, Lincoln spent time reading military strategy books, soon assumed a more active role in the day-to-day of the war, and showed a great skill for tactics. In February 1862, with a powerful offensive on the Western Front, he won his first battles. In the spring, the Union had conquered New Orleans and already controlled the crossing of the Mississippi River. Although it was good news, the loss of soldiers was terrible. During the 2 days of the war in southern Tennessee, 13,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Lincoln was criticized for not seizing McClellan and for refusing to declare emancipation. With a typical style, he responded that the objective of the war was to protect the integrity of the Union, even though he knew that the end of the slavery would be definitive to finish off the South. In September 1862, Union troops defeated General Lee's forces, and Lincoln issued a preliminary statement giving the rebels a deadline of January 1st, 1863, to surrender after the date to free all slaves. When the new year arrived, Lincoln declared the emancipation of slaves throughout the Union in an act of justice and necessity, which redefined the course of the war and became a symbolic moment. But not all were happy. With the declaration of emancipation, thousands of Northern Democrats were furious. Hart supported the war to save the Union, and for them, slavery had to be respected and limited to the south of the country. When critics demanded Lincoln to change his policy, he told them, "I walk slowly, but I never walk backward." The emancipation was a success. The 180,000 black men who joined the army were freed slaves. Despite all the war brought about a real bloodbath, Lincoln had no luck with his generals. But in June 1863, General Lee marched with his Confederate troops from Virginia through Maryland and arriving in Pennsylvania to panic across the North. The new Lincoln military chief, George Gordon Meade, who sent troops to Pennsylvania to stop the rebels. The armies met on July 1st in Gettysburg, where 170,000 men fought in the most spectacular battle of the war. On July 4th, after 3 days of combat and more than 50,000 deaths on both sides, Lee's defeated army returned to Virginia. 4 months later, in Gettysburg, a ceremony was held to honor the fallen soldiers. The main speech was delivered by Edward Everett, a very popular speaker who spoke for 2 hours, and finally Lincoln said a few words to the crowd. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitted and proper that we should do this. But in a large sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather to be dedicated here to the finished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us that from this honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave here the last full measures of devotion that we here highly resolve that this dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg speech lasted only 2 minutes and today is considered one of the best examples in writing in English. At the beginning of 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant commander-in-chief, and together they devised a plan to end the Confederation. Unfortunately, the plan did not work to defeat the reorganized Southern Army. These losses of Grant were terrible. 54,000 soldiers of the North died or were hurt during the bloody campaign. In 1864, the presidential campaign began. Lincoln had all the ballot to lose. The alarm for the war again spread to the North. Then his Republican compatriots thought about replacing him. But Lincoln was determined to continue with his position. In June, he was nominated for a second term, and as the elections approached, good news was received. General William Sherman finally defeated the Confederates of Georgia, revenging everything in their path, as well as Philip Sheridan defeated the rebels. Grant also weakened to the rivals in Richmond. On the day of the elections, nobody doubted that the Union would win the war. Everything was near its end. Lincoln's policies had triumphed, and so he won the election with 55% of the popular vote and an overwhelming victory in the electoral vote, from 212 to 21. Lincoln declared that the law of emancipation was a measure of a war that could be legally invalid when the conflict ended. The legal framework of slavery remained in force as much as in the former Confederate States and in the slave states of the Union. So, with the support of the Republican Party, a constitutional reform to abolish slavery on April 8, 1864, with a two-thirds majority of the Senate approved the 13th Amendment. The final vote took place on January 31, 1865. For Lincoln, this result was a great moral victory. The states ratified the amendment, and that was how it was added to the Constitution, and it became the law of the people. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln was sworn in for the second time. His inauguration speech was one of the best in his life, a testimony of his humanity. I do not hold a grudge against anyone. They are all my citizens. God teaches us the good way, and we must finish the task that we started. Cure the wounds of the nation. Take care of those who fell in the battle for the widows and orphans. Lasting in peace between the peoples of this country and with the rest of the world. A few weeks later, the Southern General Robert Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. During the war, Lincoln had to improvise as a strategy and general-in-chief, remediating military disasters, seditions, and internal corruption, and oppose its quiet integrity to any criticism and accusation. He acted quickly and vigorously against the insurgents and foreign intrusions, adopted drastic laws, and established a rigorous censorship of the press so that despite his clemency and moderation, he was branded as a dictator by his opponents. From 1863, the favorable march of the military operations, its protection measures to the development of the industry, and its conciliatory policy with respect to the unruly state allowed him to maintain the confidence of his fellow citizens. After the war, Lincoln raised the plan for the reconstruction of the Union in the political arena, that is, the reincorporation of the rebel states to the federal Congress. And also, since the blacks were free, there were not yet full citizens. The Devolution, it was only the first step. What the slaves will do, how they will coexist with the slavers of the South. 5 months later, Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a show at Ford Theater in Washington. where Lincoln was shot in the back by an anti-abolitionist, actor John Booth, who murdered the president at the worst possible moment. Lincoln was taken to a patient across the street from the theater, but he never regained consciousness and died in the early hours of the morning after April 15, 1865. He left the person who had won the Civil War, who gave freedom to the slaves, who signed the first act of the farm that allowed the poor to obtain a land, who led the Union to victory in the Civil War. He was described as a balanced man, determined with great moral principles and possessed of an enormous patriotism. Of all the reforms he carried out, they established the government's obligation to ensure equal opportunities for all people during the following decades. From humble origins emerged an extraordinary man. Currently, he has been the most capable president of all history, who has shown courage and integrity, humble and honesty. During the following decades, many presidents want to imitate this wise man who always chose the appropriate words. He showed the world how to fight for what is right and how to stand up for what a person believes. He showed the world how to successfully achieve goals through skilled leadership and wise decision making. He was an incredible man who passes on human understanding and someone who influenced people against slavery and told them to treat people with the same rights and equality. Without his efforts, this nation would not exist. The hero of our nation, Abraham Lincoln.